I do have to ask you about that first spark with Gwen.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not something that anybody could have seen coming besides God, I guess, because it doesn't look like it would make sense, you know. But all I can tell you is it does. It just makes the most perfect sense. Gwen saved my life.
Blake Shelton had always been the guy who hid his real emotions behind jokes, confidence, and that easy country charm. But there was one moment, quiet, unexpected, and unlike anything fans had seen, when he finally let a truth slip that he'd kept buried for years. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't said for attention. It sounded more like something that had been weighing on him for far too long. And what he revealed later left even his closest friends stunned. This wasn't about fame, career pressure, or public headlines. It was something far more personal, a moment that changed the entire direction of his life. And at the center of that life-altering shift was Gwen Stefani, stepping into his world at exactly the time he needed someone the most. Before we dive deeper into this story, make sure to subscribe for more powerful celebrity moments fans rarely get to hear about. The hidden collapse before Gwen. Before Gwen Stefani ever stepped into Blake Shelton's life, there was a period he rarely talked about, one marked by quiet struggles that played out far away from the cameras. From the outside, Blake looked like the same charismatic performer with the sharp humor and steady presence fans loved. But behind that familiar smile, he was carrying a mix of exhaustion, pressure, and emotional weight that kept building year after year. Friends later said they noticed the changes: long silences, canceled plans, and a distant look that didn't match the upbeat image he showed the world. Blake was dealing with the fallout of personal heartbreak, endless touring, and the kind of loneliness that hits even harder when you're surrounded by people every day. Industry demands didn't slow down, and the expectation to stay strong and funny only pushed him further into himself. There were nights he felt completely drained, unsure how much longer he could keep pretending everything was fine, and although he never publicly described it in detail, fans sensed he had gone through a dark emotional stretch long before he opened up about it. But as everything seemed to be falling apart, an unexpected connection was about to change everything. Because just when Blake felt the weight becoming too heavy to carry alone, someone new walked into his life, someone who would see the cracks he tried so hard to hide. And that person was Gwen Stefani. She was the bold, stylish pop icon with a bright personality, while he was the grounded country star who preferred simplicity over spectacle. Yet behind the scenes, both were quietly going through emotional storms that none of their fans fully understood. Blake, still trying to steady himself from the personal chaos he'd been carrying, walked onto set each day with the same easy grin, but people close to him said they could sense something deeper beneath the surface. Gwen, dealing with her own difficult chapter, recognized that same heaviness in Blake almost instantly. There was something about their early conversations, simple, honest, and surprisingly raw, that struck Blake in a way he didn't expect. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't trying to hide what he felt. Gwen didn't push him to talk, but she listened in a way that made him feel seen, and that alone was something he hadn't felt in months. Crew members later mentioned how they noticed the shift. Blake seemed calmer when Gwen was around, more relaxed, almost like the weight on his shoulders had eased just a little. He wasn't fully open yet, but something within him recognized that this connection wasn't accidental. There was a quiet comfort forming between them, something that would become the foundation of everything that unfolded next. And soon, Gwen would witness a moment that made her realize Blake was carrying far more than he ever let on. The emotional breakdown Blake never talked about publicly. Blake Shelton went through a period of emotional exhaustion long before he ever opened up about it publicly. While he continued smiling for cameras and cracking jokes on set, he was quietly carrying the weight of major life changes. Those close to him noticed he often seemed withdrawn, lost in thought, and overwhelmed by the chaos happening outside the spotlight. It was during these difficult months that Blake found himself relying heavily on quiet moments, trying to make sense of everything he was feeling without letting the world see how deeply it affected him. What made this period even more significant was the fact that Blake later acknowledged just how much Gwen Stefani helped him through it. In a real interview quoted by Billboard and highlighted by People, Blake said openly that Gwen saved my life during the darkest chapter of his emotional journey. Hearing him share that truth years later made it clear that this was not just a passing low point, it was a moment that changed the direction of his entire life, and it was also the first sign of just how meaningful Gwen's presence would become. Quick pause, subscribe now for more surprising celebrity moments you've never heard before. Gwen steps in, the conversation that changed his life. The shift between Blake and Gwen didn't happen with grand gestures or public moments. It began with a quiet, honest conversation that many believe changed everything. According to fan discussions and behind-the-scenes accounts, Gwen approached Blake one day after noticing he had been unusually distant. She didn't ask for details or push him to open up. Instead, she simply told him she was there if he ever needed someone to talk to. That simple offer, the kind without judgment or pressure, was something Blake hadn't heard in a long time. For the first time, he felt safe enough to let a few pieces of the truth slip out. He admitted he'd been struggling with the emotional fallout of his past, the pressure of constant travel, and the feeling of being stuck in his own head, more than he ever wanted to admit. Gwen listened quietly, offering understanding instead of solution. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't a full confession, but it was the first time Blake allowed someone to see behind the curtain he kept tightly closed. Gwen's response wasn't pity, it was compassion. She shared her own struggles, creating a bond built on mutual pain, healing, and trust. Blake later hinted in interviews that Gwen had shown him a kind of comfort he didn't know he needed, someone who stepped into his life with patience and care. And though he didn't know it then, this single conversation would become the foundation for a connection that would eventually change him forever. But the most powerful moment between them, the one that revealed just how much Gwen truly meant to him, was still to come. Blake's private confession, "You saved my life." As Blake and Gwen grew closer, their connection moved far beyond casual conversation and TV chemistry. Away from the stage lights and cameras, Blake finally had someone he could be honest with about how heavy life had felt in the months surrounding his divorce. In quiet moments, he opened up about the emotional weight he'd been carrying, the confusion, and the feeling of having his entire world turned upside down. Gwen didn't rush him, didn't minimize what he was feeling, and didn't try to pretend it was easy. She just listened, shared her own experiences, and reminded him that he didn't have to go through it alone. Later, Blake would openly acknowledge just how much her support meant during that time. In an appearance on CMT's Hot 20 Countdown, covered by Refinery29, he said he tells people all the time that Gwen saved my life, describing how deeply she helped him through that year. Those words weren't scripted or exaggerated, they came from someone who had lived through a painful season and found unexpected strength in another person. For Blake, that honest admission reflected what he already knew in private. Gwen wasn't just a comforting presence, she was a turning point. From that moment on, his story was no longer just about surviving a difficult chapter, it was about how her support helped him start over with a different kind of hope. The career storm that nearly broke him again, despite his growing bond with Gwen, Blake still faced immense pressure behind closed doors. The fast-paced world of The Voice, constant touring demands, and expectations from fans and the industry created a cycle that left little room for recovery. Even with newfound emotional support, he struggled with burnout that kept building beneath the surface. People close to the show noticed the signs: quiet moments backstage, fatigue during long taping days, and a heaviness in his demeanor that didn't match the cheerful Judge viewers saw on screen. Online rumors later suggested that Blake was dealing with a level of stress he didn't want to burden anyone with, not even Gwen. He worried about letting people down, about appearing weak, and about falling behind in a career that demanded non-stop energy. Even though Gwen brought him strength, external pressures didn't simply disappear. The long hours, the travel, the expectations, all of it continued to take a toll. Those close to him believed he was entering another overwhelming chapter, one that threatened to undo the emotional progress he had made. Blake tried to stay strong, but the weight of responsibility was becoming harder to hide. It was during one of these exhausting stretches that he reached another low point, one that would have hit even harder if Gwen hadn't been right there beside him. And what she did next showed just how deeply she understood what he was facing. The night Gwen refused to leave his side. There was one night, quiet, largely unspoken of, and remembered mostly through fan speculation and insider whispers, when Gwen realized Blake was slipping back into the emotional shadows he had once shared with her. It wasn't a dramatic breakdown, it was the kind that happens silently, where someone's eyes say more than their words ever could. Blake seemed distant, exhausted, and disconnected, carrying the weight of everything without asking for help. Gwen didn't wait for him to explain. She recognized the signs immediately. Instead of letting him retreat into silence, she chose to stay with him, sitting beside him through the quiet moments, offering comfort without needing answers. She didn't try to talk him out of how he felt or push him to open up. She simply stayed, grounding him with her presence alone. According to unverified accounts, that night became a defining moment in their relationship. Blake later hinted in interviews that there were times Gwen stood by him when he didn't even have the strength to ask for support. This night was believed to be one of those moments. Her calmness, her patience, and her willingness to sit with him through the heaviness showed Blake something no one else had given him: unconditional support. And in the stillness of that night, something shifted. Blake realized he wasn't facing his battles alone anymore. Gwen wasn't just someone who listened, she was someone who stayed, even when things were at their hardest. But what happened after that night would make their connection even stronger, shaping the emotional transformation Blake stepped into next. Quick reminder, don't miss the next story. Hit subscribe to stay updated. How Gwen rebuilt Blake's confidence. As Blake and Gwen grew closer, something inside him began to shift in a way he hadn't felt in years. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come from a dramatic moment. It came through small, steady changes that built on one another. Gwen encouraged Blake to slow down when he needed to breathe between the pressure of touring, filming, and constant attention. She brought a calming presence into his life, something he didn't realize he'd been missing until he felt it again. Blake started rediscovering pieces of himself he had unintentionally pushed aside. He approached his music with more emotion, finding new meaning in lyrics he once sang out of routine. His interviews became more thoughtful, showing glimpses of someone who had taken time to reflect and grow. Even his presence on The Voice felt different, lighter, more grounded, more connected to the moments unfolding around him. Gwen didn't try to change him, she simply supported him in becoming the best version of himself. Whether they were talking between rehearsals or sharing quiet moments off camera, she helped him see a sense of balance he had lost. Her steady encouragement reminded him that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, and that relying on someone during difficult times didn't make him any less strong. People around him noticed the transformation, not because he announced it, but because it naturally showed in the way he carried himself. Blake wasn't just recovering, he was rebuilding, and that new version of him was shaped in part by Gwen's presence, understanding, and gentle influence. What he felt inside was becoming clearer with each passing day. Soon Blake would share a truth he had been holding privately, something heartfelt that would deeply move the people listening. Blake's public admission, the interview that shocked fans. The day Blake chose to speak openly about his emotional journey marked a powerful shift in how the world understood his relationship with Gwen. In interviews, he began to move past the light jokes and casual comments, instead sharing how deeply that period of his life had affected him, and how important Gwen had been in getting him through it. He talked about the pain of going through a public divorce, and how rare it was to find someone who truly understood what that felt like on both a personal and public level. What stood out most was how clearly he credited Gwen for helping him through that darkness. As highlighted in a detailed relationship feature by People, Blake recalled telling Billboard that Gwen saved my life, explaining that no one else could understand going through a high-profile divorce from another musician the way she did. For fans, hearing him speak this openly was a rare glimpse into the heart behind the headlines. It showed that their relationship wasn't built on image or convenience, it was built on shared pain, mutual support, and real healing. That public admission didn't just confirm how serious their bond was, it revealed how deeply Gwen had helped reshape Blake's life at a time when he needed it most. Why Blake finally told the truth. Blake's decision to share that deeply personal admission didn't happen suddenly. It was the result of years of growth, reflection, and emotional rebuilding. For a long time, he had preferred to keep his private struggles to himself, believing that staying quiet was the simplest way to move forward. But as he changed and as his connection with Gwen strengthened, Blake began to recognize the importance of acknowledging the people who helped him through his hardest moments. he finally spoke about it because it felt genuine. After carrying those feelings silently for so long, he realized it was time to honor the person who had supported him without expectation. Gwen had stood by him through difficult transitions, listened when he needed to talk, and encouraged him when he felt worn down. Sharing his gratitude publicly wasn't about creating a headline, it was about giving credit where it was truly due. Opening up also allowed Blake to embrace vulnerability in a new way. Instead of hiding behind humor or brushing off emotional questions, he chose honest. Fans saw a different side of him, one grounded in reflection and personal truth. His openness resonated with people who understood that even the strongest, most admired individuals sometimes need someone to lean on. By choosing to speak from the heart, Blake showed that his emotional journey was not just a private battle, it was a testament to the impact one person can have on another's life. And through his words, it became clear just how deeply Gwen had helped him find himself again. The final piece of his confession brought everything full circle, revealing the emotional depth behind one of the most meaningful chapters of his story. It becomes clear that his most meaningful transformation didn't come from fame, success, or the spotlight. It came from finding someone who understood him at his lowest and helped him rise again. Gwen Stefani didn't just walk into his life, she changed the emotional direction of. Through patience, compassion, and quiet support, she helped him rebuild the parts of himself he thought he had lost. And when Blake finally spoke openly about what she meant to him, it wasn't for attention, it was simply the truth he had carried for years. Their story is a reminder that even the strongest people can feel lost, and sometimes it takes just one person to help them find their way back. Blake's confession wasn't dramatic or exaggerated, it was heartfelt, honest, and deeply human. In sharing it, he showed the world that healing often begins with being understood. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more revealing celebrity moments you won't hear anywhere else.